This is Duke University.
My name is Dani Moore. I was born in 1969 in a naval hospital in Newport, Rhode Island. And that's because my dad was still in the Navy and active in the Vietnam War. And then we moved around quite a bit with my dad's job after he returned to the United States from the war. And I mostly grew up, after the moving around for a few years, I mostly grew up in eastern North Carolina in a small town called Tarboro, with a T, not to be confused with Carborough.
Okay.
But Tarboro is a small town near Rocky Mount. We were struggling economically, financially, growing up because my mom was a single mom who often earned minimum wage. There were times that she earned a little more, but there was a certain level of precariousness about her job situation. So we lived in a working class neighborhood in Tarboro. We were really lucky to have our own small home, a little brick home in a neighborhood. It's interesting, now that I work on immigrants' rights and migration, it's kind of, I'm a bit embarrassed that I grew up not seeing and not knowing about migrant workers or migrant communities in North Carolina in those years, in the 70s and 80s. But to tell the truth, it was very invisible to all of us, to our church, to our school. There was one family in my school that they had 2 boys, and they were immigrants from China, and they owned a local Chinese restaurant. And that was really our only sense of who was an immigrant in our community. So I really saw the world in black and white. I learned really powerful messages about African American communities and white communities and how the two should interact with each other and what they believed about each other. I believe that there were a combination of African American and migrant workers from Mexico and other parts of Latin America in the fields during those years in North Carolina, but they were completely invisible to those of us, like I said, at school, at church, and in different parts of my life. We had no Latino children in our schools at all. And like I mentioned, only 2 Asian students in our school. So it was a very black and white world, and that really shaped a lot of my understanding of the world growing up in North Carolina. I have a little story to tell about that. In the 1990s, when I was working for a reproductive rights organization based in Durham, someone came from a national Latino reproductive justice organization and asked me about the Latino community in North Carolina. This was before I had worked on immigration at all. And I think it was also before the primary Latino organizations that we know of now had gotten started. So probably 1993, 94. I told her that I thought it would be great if she reached out to some of the farm worker organizations because those were really the only Latinos I knew about in North Carolina. And so that answer, that answer that I gave her that was true for me, I think it also points to the fact that in the 1990s, those of us who grew up in North Carolina and knew North Carolina well really hadn't yet seen the people from the Latino community who were becoming part of our state. Right after college was when I was starting to figure out what I believed. And one of the things that really affected me greatly was in the news and really sort of jolted me into thinking about political vision and political ideology more. It was the Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas hearings that dealt with sexual harassment. But to me, it was like an incredibly interesting study in race and power, gender, oppression, to see all of those older white male senators questioning law professor Anita Hill, an African-American woman, about the behavior of an African-American man who had been her coworker and mentor. To me, it brought up a lot of questions for me, like, what do I really believe about power and who should be in the Senate? Asking those questions. I think there should be more women, and I think there should be more African-Americans in that room. What do I really believe about being a strong woman? and would I ever consider a career in law, or would I ever want to work in policy? So that whole period, watching those, the testimony on TV, really led me into reading a lot more about politics and about feminism. And I think once you start looking into feminist theory and reading feminists, especially those of us that realize we need to read more than white feminists, you start realizing the connections between the issues. And for me, it became impossible to continue not unpacking white supremacy and not unpacking some of the other things that I had learned growing up as I was trying to think through my ideas on economic justice. I went to graduate school in 1998, so I had about 4 or 5 years of doing other things. Before graduate school, I worked for NARAL for a while. That was half-time. I worked half-time for an organization here in Durham called the Institute for Public Media Arts that was using documentary film, radio, photography for social change purposes. And several people here at the Center for Documentary Studies were on our board and influencing our work there. I also worked in a battered women's shelter on the weekends. That was the first time I was starting to see Latino families intersecting with the nonprofit world that I was part of. We had our first Latinas staying at the shelter. I also worked for a little while for a company, like a startup company, internet company that was trying to cover community and politics. And so I was an editor for a company called City Search that was based here in the Triangle. I wanted to figure out grad school, and I was really having a hard time choosing between some public policy programs that looked really interesting to me and a couple of divinity programs. I looked at both Harvard Divinity School and Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And partially why I was interested in those was, having read about Black liberation theology. And when I visited Union, I got to meet James Cone, one of the great heroes in that field and one of the great writers and thinkers. I got accepted to both types of programs, and I can tell you a little bit more about why I wanted to go to grad school and what I felt like I kind of needed to explore and learn. But ultimately, the policy school list of classes didn't look quite as interesting as what I'd be able to do at Harvard. And there's a lot of flexibility. When you study at Harvard Divinity School, you can also take classes at the Kennedy School of Government, the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and in the college. And so I was attracted to the idea of studying with Cornel West, who had been someone I had read a lot and really appreciated him very much, to study with Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham on the role of the Black church in social movements. So there were a number of people at Harvard that I was interested to learn from. When I first went to Harvard Divinity School, I was most interested, like I said, in learning about Black theology, liberation theology, and coming back to the South and working for racial justice here. I'd had a few models of white women working in racial justice from groups like NCARV and others in the South that I really wanted to figure out what that would look like for me. And I believed then, and I still believe, that a lot of the good work in social movement that happens is through the institution of the church. I wanted to study more how the church had played a role in the civil rights movement, how ministers and people of faith had stepped up into leadership roles and activist roles in that movement through their church as sort of a base. But I'm actually not very religious myself. And so it was with a lot of questions about faith and religion that I went to divinity school. I could not have gone to a divinity school that was less progressive or sort of more conservative divinity school. As it happens, I was interested in the two divinity schools that tend to be the most grounded in progressive social movements and the most interfaith. So I was learning alongside, Buddhists and Muslims and others. And that was really important to me because I didn't want it to be a Christian-only look at this history. And I thought after graduate school I would end up working somehow in a bridge role between Black church structures and the ongoing quest for racial justice in the South. But what happened is I actually got an internship in an immigrants' rights organization. And it was the first time that I had worked directly with immigrants and in the movement for immigrants' rights. It was so interesting to me, and I learned so much by working there. I worked there for 3 years, so I really liked it, and I stuck with it. And it was just perfect timing because North Carolina, at the time I was in grad school, was just, kind of riding the crest of the huge migration that's happened in North Carolina. It was really a very rich time to rethink what racial justice looked like in North Carolina as more than just black and white. Yeah. So I feel like, and of course working in Boston, which is known as such an immigration city, a city where immigration is rich in the history, working on immigrants' rights in Boston or Los Angeles or New York is very different than coming back to North Carolina's Triangle region and working on immigrants' rights. So I felt like there were a lot of lessons I learned from those places that served me well and helped me step up to certain challenges here in North Carolina. But also, we have to make our own stories in these newer states. I wanted to be able to engage with people across those differences of faith and politics and ideology with respect and be able to engage in dialogue, not completely dehumanize and silence them, but to be able to maybe build some common understanding based on people's faith traditions of how we might treat each other, what we might owe to each other as brothers and sisters in the world or as people in the world. So what does the business owner owe to the worker? What does one family owe to another family if there's violence in the neighborhood? What does the United States owe to immigrants when they come to our country seeking a better life? All those questions for me are probably issues of faith, ethics, spirituality. And even though I'm not super religious in terms of an institutional religious orientation right now, I think that those questions of how we treat each other and what we owe each other are religious questions for many people living in North Carolina. I think that as people learn more about migration, particularly in North Carolina, they unlearn some of the myths that they've been taught. For example, I think that many people in North Carolina, like me growing up, never thought about immigration, never thought about immigrants and who they were and what their stories were. I think we assumed that everybody could come legally if they just tried. I think that's a very pervasive myth that happens all across our state. I think that in North Carolina, helping people to understand the stories of Ellis Island, the stories of immigration laws, and how many families in North Carolina are actually mixed status families, where some people are citizens, some people are green card holders, some people are in process, some people are just waiting for an additional approval, some people are here without authorization but might be able to get in line later. All of these things are part of what I think North Carolinians could benefit from if they learn more about this.
Produced by Duke University.